Norfolk was still wearing the night. A thin, bruised blue hung over the river, and the shipyards, making the parking lot lamps outside Bayview Medical Center, looked tired. The hospital itself sat bright and steady, on the rise, all glass, in hard angles, windows glowing like a long-held breath. Dante Hargrove stood in the security booth with both hands wrapped around a paper cup. The coffee had gone lukewarm, bitter, on his tongue, but it kept his fingers from stiffening. He watched the access road through glass, waiting for the parade of nurses and delivery trucks. Instead, headlights rounded the bend, slow and careful. A dark sedan rolled into the lot and stopped without searching for the nearest space. The engine shut off. A man stepped out, tall, broad, in the shoulders, dressed plain. He closed the door softly, like he was trying not to wake someone. He stood there a moment, looking up at the hospital breath fogging in front of his face. Then he walked to the edge of the lot and stopped under a lamp, hands behind his back, feet planted. Still, another set of headlights appeared. Then another. 2 motorcycles came in low engines, briefly, loud in the quiet, then cut to silence. Riders swung off and tucked their helmets under an arm. A pickup with a dented tailgate eased into a space and shut down. A woman climbed out in jeans and a dark hoodie, hair pulled tight, posture straight like a drawn line. They did not drift toward the entrance in a messy crowd. They arranged themselves, without trying small groups, turning into a loose arc that faced the building. They greeted each other with nods, quick grips, at the forearm, a palm, on a shoulder. No laughter. No, "How have you been?" The cold air carried only small sounds. Doors clicking shut, boots on wet asphalt, the soft hiss of someone's breath through their teeth. Dante set his cup down and thumbed his radio. He did not press the button yet. He opened the booth door and stepped out. The cold bit his cheeks and filled his nose with the sharp smell of damp pavement and salt. From somewhere inside the building came a muffled rhythm, faint but steady. Monitor beeps, a heartbeat you could hear through walls if you listened hard enough. A man walked past Dante, close enough for Dante to notice the man's eyes. They moved in quick, efficient sweeps over the lot, over the doors, over the roofline. It was not panic. It was habit. Dante cleared his throat. "Morning." The man stopped and looked at him. His face held no smile, but it was not hostile either. "Morning," the man said. "Can I help you folks with something?" Dante asked. The man glanced toward the hospital, then back. He seemed to weigh Dante like he might weigh a door that did not want to open. "We're fine," he said. Dante waited for more. None came. The man nodded once, polite, and kept walking. Another car pulled in. Another motorcycle. The lot filled in slow increments, like a tide creeping up the beach. Dante watched the arc tighten. More faces, different ages. Some bodies moved like they were still young and unbroken. Others carried stiffness in their shoulders and knees, but their eyes stayed the same. Alert, quiet. A small piece of metal flashed on one collar when the person turned under the lamp. It caught the light and threw it back, a sharp glint that made Dante squint. It was not jewelry. It looked like something earned and worn without pride. Inside the hospital, the lobby lights dimmed for the early hour. A night shift nurse in pale scrubs crossed the floor with a paper chart tucked against her hip. She stopped when she noticed movement outside the glass. Her steps slowed, then halted. She went to the window and stared. Another nurse joined her, then an orderly. Their bodies leaned forward as if their eyes could pull meaning out of the dark. Up on the 3rd floor, the ICU did not care about the hour. It hummed in the same steady way it always did. Air scrubbers whispered. A ventilator clicked and sighed. A monitor traced green lines across black and pinged patient and exact. In the waiting area, outside the secured doors, Frank Delaney sat hunched in a plastic chair that was too small for his frame. He kept his coat on. He held his cane between his knees, with both hands, knuckles pale, eyes fixed on nothing. At his feet, Koa lay, curled tight nose, on paws, ears, pricked toward every shift in the hallway. The dog's vest was faded olive, Velcro worn soft at the edges, patch peeling at one corner as if time had tried to lift it away. Frank's hand rested on Koa's shoulder. His fingers moved in slow circles that did not quite calm either of them. Footsteps approached down the corridor. Koa's head lifted. The dog's eyes tracked the movement, then flicked toward the window at the end of the hall. A band of gray light slid across the linoleum. Shadows moved through that light, too many to count. Frank did not turn. He had spent too many years learning what a room felt like before he looked at it. The air had changed. Not fear. Wait. A young resident came out of the elevator with a tablet in hand and stopped short when he saw the crowd through the glass. He stared, then looked down the hallway at Frank. His mouth opened like he wanted to ask something. He swallowed it and walked on. Downstairs, the automatic doors sighed open as a pair of orderlies wheeled out a cart of linens. Cold rushed in, the smell of diesel and wet metal. The people outside did not step forward. They held their positions, faces turned toward the building, as if the doors were a line that belonged to the hospital. A man with a battered ball cap walked to the sidewalk and stopped just short of triggering the sensors. He stood there, hands at his sides, eyes on the glass. On his collar, a small pin caught the lamplight and flashed again. 3 prongs, a clean, hard shape. Dante watched from his booth. His radio crackled once with a half-formed voice, then fell quiet. He lifted his cup. The coffee was cold all the way through. Across the lot, the nurse behind the glass pressed her hand to her mouth. Her eyes shone. She said something low to the person beside her, but the words did not carry. Outside, the arc of bodies settled into a deeper stillness. No one paced. No one checked the time. Their attention stayed fixed on the bright, breathing building. Dawn edged up pale and slow, turning the mist above the asphalt into a soft gray veil. In that new light, Dante could finally see their faces clearly. Young, old, all of them calm in the same way, like they had decided together, and without discussion, that this was where they would stand. Somewhere deep inside Bayview, a monitor kept time. 24 hours earlier, Casey Monroe dropped her last pair of gloves into the red bin and stood still long enough to feel the emergency department's noise settle into her bones. A stretcher rattled past. A monitor chirped bright and impatient. Somewhere behind a curtain, a patient coughed until it turned into a wet gasp and then mercifully eased. Casey flexed her fingers. The skin around her knuckles looked pale from sanitizer, and her wrists stung where latex had rubbed all night. She checked her watch. 12 hours gone, in a blur of bright lights and sharper voices. She took one last look down the row of bays. A teenage boy slept with an oxygen cannula taped crooked under his nose. An older woman stared at a plastic basin in her lap like it held answers. A man in a cheap suit sat on the floor, back against the wall, eyes fixed on the curtain in front of his wife. Casey had learned to leave without lingering. If she lingered, the shift followed her. At the nurse's station, Brooke Patel was snapping caps onto syringes with the fast rhythm of someone who refused to move slowly. Her ponytail had started the shift tidy and ended it with a wild curl at her neck. She saw Casey and lifted her chin. "Please tell me you ate," Brooke said. Casey pulled a face. 2 granola bars. One was mostly crumbs. "That's not food. That's punishment," Brooke said. She reached into her pocket and held out a peppermint, the wrapper already warm from her hand. "Take this before you scare small children with your breath." Casey took it and tore it open with her teeth. The mint hit sharp and cold, slicing through the lingering taste of coffee and antiseptic. Brooke's eyes flicked to Casey's phone when it buzzed again on the counter. Casey did not pick it up. She flipped it face down instead. Brooke did not ask who it was. She just said softer, "You good?" "I'm fine," Casey said, quick enough to sound like a lie. Brooke rested her forearms on the desk. "Fine means you're going to disappear." Casey stared at the last chart she had signed. The cursor blinked on the screen, patient and accusing. Her hands held steady, but she could still feel a moment from earlier, when a monitor tone had stretched too long, when someone shouted a number, and the room tightened like a fist. She had pressed her palms flat on the bed rail to keep them from shaking. "I'm just tired," Casey said. "Then eat," Brooke said. "And don't go straight home and sit in the dark." Casey swallowed. Home meant quiet. Quiet meant hearing the shift replay itself in her head, every sound sharper without the hospital around it. She nodded once and forced her voice to stay light. "I'm grabbing coffee," she said. "Something warm." Brooke's expression eased just a fraction. "Good. Do that." Casey pushed through the staff door. The hallway behind the emergency department was dimmer, calmer, but the building still hummed. Wheels squeaked. A ventilation fan sighed. Someone called a name over the intercom, steady and clipped. In the locker room, the air smelled like damp fabric and old coffee. Casey opened her locker and saw her street clothes hanging untouched. On the top shelf sat a small photo of her father on a boat smiling like the world was simple. She let her eyes rest on it for a beat, then looked away. She peeled off her badge and set it on the shelf as if it could hold the shift there. She changed into jeans and a sweatshirt, movements a little stiff. In the mirror, she looked composed, which was its own kind of lie. She washed her hands anyway. Soap, rinse, dry. The ritual never helped, but she kept doing it. Jace Rivera stepped in while she was tying her shoes. He carried a thermos and his keys. His scrubs were clean now, but his eyes still looked like they were watching numbers on a screen. "You heading out?" he asked. Casey nodded. "Yeah." Brooke came in behind him, shrugging into her jacket. "She's about to pretend she can live on mince and spite," Brooke said. Jace's mouth twitched. "That sounds like half our staff." Brooke rolled her eyes. "Don't encourage her." Jace looked at Casey. "You driving?" "I might walk," Casey said. Brooke stopped mid-zip. "In this weather?" "It's only a few blocks," Casey said. Her voice sounded casual, but her body already leaned toward the door, like it wanted open air more than sleep. Jace took a sip from his thermos and winced. Cold coffee. Tragic. His gaze slid to Casey's wrists, the raw line of irritation, but he kept his questions to himself. "Stay on the main streets," he said. Brooke pointed at Casey with the peppermint wrapper. "Text me when you get home." Casey nodded. "I will." Brooke and Jace left first. Their footsteps faded down the corridor, replaced by the soft click of a closing door. Casey waited a second longer, listening to the building breathe, the distant beeps, the low whisper of machines. She could go home and sit in silence with all of it, or she could put herself somewhere that had light and voices, in the clink of a spoon against a cup. She grabbed her bag and walked out. The employee exit released her into cold air that stung her cheeks and made her eyes water. The back lot was damp, the pavement dark. From the river came a faint, metallic smell and the low moan of a ship's horn, long and tired. Casey pulled her hood up and started down the sidewalk. Streetlights pooled yellow on the ground. A few cars moved on the main road, tires hissing on wet asphalt. Her phone buzzed again inside her bag. She did not reach for it. At the next corner, a man walked a dog on a short leash. The dog was old, muzzle pale, moving with careful steps, but it kept close to the man's knee as if the space between them mattered. Casey's eyes followed them for a second after they passed. She turned onto a side street lined with brick and shuttered storefronts. The briny air carried the faint smell of diesel from a truck idling near a loading bay. Then warmth appeared. A rectangle of light spilled onto the street from a diner, low and bright, its neon sign buzzing softly. Harbor Light. The last letters flickered stubbornly, holding on. Casey slowed. Through the glass, she saw a counter gleaming under lights, a waitress pouring coffee, a couple hunched over plates like the rest of the world could wait. The door opened for a person leaving, and the bell above it rang clear and simple into the cold. Casey stopped long enough to let that sound land. She crossed the street and pushed the door open. The bell rang again, and warm air rushed over her face. The air smelled of brewed coffee and toasted bread. The noise inside was soft human. When the door shut, the cold street sounded farther away. Casey stepped fully inside and let the door close behind her. The bell above it rang out, bright and clean, then settled into silence. Warmth wrapped around her, like a blanket pulled from a dryer. Her glasses fogged at the edges for a second. She blinked and breathed in. Coffee, toasted bread, butter melting on something hot. A faint bite of fryer oil that never quite left a place like this. Harbor Light Diner was small, older than the condos, creeping closer to the water. The booths were upholstered in cracked red vinyl that stuck lightly to the back of her sweatshirt when she slid past. The counter ran along the right side, chrome trim, dulled by years of hands and cleaning rags. Behind it, a waitress moved with the practiced speed of someone who had carried plates through worse crowds than this. A couple sat near the far wall, shoulders angled toward each other, murmuring over a shared basket of fries. A man in a windbreaker hunched over a newspaper, his coffee untouched, as if he was waiting for the caffeine to come to him. Casey picked a booth near the window, without thinking. It was the same choice she always made when she ate alone. Back to a wall, line of sight to the door, a clear path to stand up if she needed to. She set her bag beside her and rolled her shoulders once, slow. The muscles in her neck protested. She pressed her palms flat on the table, and let herself feel the warmth seeping up through the laminate. It was a small thing, but it was real. The waitress appeared at her booth with a pad and pen. She had silver hair gathered into a loose bun, glasses perched low on her nose, and a face that looked stern until her eyes softened. "You look like you wrestled the whole city," the waitress said. Casey managed a tired smile. "Just the usual." "Coffee?" the waitress asked, already reaching for the pot. "Please," Casey said. "Black." The waitress poured, without spilling a drop. The stream was steady, dark, and steaming. Casey watched it like it was a spell. "You want food?" with that, the waitress asked. Casey hesitated. Hunger was there, but it felt distant, like a radio station, fading in and out. She thought about Brooke's face, the way her friend had said, "Fine means you are going to disappear." "A grilled cheese," Casey said, "and fries." The waitress nodded once. "Good choice. Sit tight." She moved away with the same quiet authority she had arrived with. Casey wrapped her hands around the mug. The heat bit her skin just enough to make her present. She brought it to her lips and took a careful sip. Bitter, hot, clean. Her eyelids threatened to drop. She forced them open and let her gaze travel around the room, not because she thought danger was waiting in a diner, but because it was a habit carved into her by too many nights under fluorescent lights. She could not turn off the part of her that watched. That was when she noticed the man at the counter. He sat on a stool near the middle body, angled slightly away from everyone, as if he had chosen the spot for the same reason she had chosen her booth. His back was broad, but his shoulders sagged. Gray hair curled at his collar. His hands were thick and weathered, the kind that looked like they had gripped ropes and tools, not pens. He held his coffee mug with both hands, as if he was warming something deeper than his fingers. At his feet lay a dog, not a pet, curled in a lazy sprawl. This dog was tucked close, spine straight, head down, but not asleep. Its eyes tracked the room with calm attention, following movement without turning its whole body. The dog wore a vest that had faded to a tired olive. The Velcro at the edges was worn soft. A patch near the shoulder had begun to peel at one corner. On the side, stitched letters spelled a name. Koa. Casey felt her stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. In Norfolk, you learn to spot the small signs. A tattoo half hidden by a sleeve. A haircut that never grew out. A posture that carried discipline even when the body was tired. Service dogs were common enough, but this one was different. There was something in the dog's stillness that reminded her of a monitor line that was steady, honest, and unforgiving. The older man reached down and rested his fingers on Koa's head. The gesture was brief, almost restrained. Not a doting pat, more like a check-in. Koa's tail thumped once against the floor, quiet as a secret. Casey watched without staring. She knew the look of someone who wanted to be left alone, and she recognized it because she wore it herself. The waitress passed behind the counter and topped off the older man's coffee. She did it without asking, like it was part of the rhythm here. The man nodded in thanks without meeting her eyes. His gaze stayed forward, fixed on the napkin holder and the sugar packets, as if those plain objects gave him something safe to focus on. Casey took another sip and let her eyes drift to the kitchen window behind the counter. The cook was a big man with forearms like hams. He stood at a cutting board and ran a knife along a steel in short strokes. Shk, shk, shk. It was not loud, but it carried. The sound made the hair along Casey's arms rise. Koa's ears twitched. The dog's head lifted a fraction, eyes flicking toward the kitchen window. Then the dog settled again, calm, restored by discipline. The older man did not look down, but his fingers pressed more firmly against the dog's fur for a moment. Casey felt an old memory stir, unwanted. Her father at the kitchen sink, sharpening a fillet knife before a fishing trip. The same sound, the same patient motion. Back then it had meant dinner. Now, in her body, it meant something else. Her coffee mug clicked softly when she set it down. She realized she had been holding it too tight. The waitress returned and set a basket of fries on the table. Then a plate with grilled cheese, cut clean down the center. The cheese inside gleamed, stretching in a thin line when the sandwich shifted. Eat, the waitress said, like it was an order. Casey gave a small nod. Thanks. The waitress lingered just long enough to glance toward the counter. You here from the hospital, she asked. Casey looked down at her hands. The faint smell of sanitizer still lived on her skin. Yeah. The waitress's eyes softened again. Rough one. Casey could have lied. She could have smoothed it over, made it light. Instead, she said, long. The waitress nodded, like she understood exactly what that meant. You take care of yourself, she said. Then she walked away, leaving Casey with food and warmth and her own thoughts Casey lifted half the sandwich and took a bite. The bread was crisp and buttery. The cheese was too hot, burning her tongue. She welcomed the sting. It made her feel like she was still in control of something. At the counter, the older man shifted. His stool scraped lightly. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded cloth, then a small pill bottle. He turned it in his hand, reading the label without opening it. His jaw tightened. He put it back. Casey watched that too, and understood more than she wanted to. Pride was not always loud. Sometimes it was a man refusing help in the quietest possible way. Koa's eyes flicked toward Casey's booth for the first time. The dog held her gaze for a beat. The look was not friendly. It was not unfriendly either. It was assessment. The dog seemed to decide she belonged to the room, and then it looked away. Casey exhaled slowly through her nose. She did not realize she had been holding her breath. She ate a few more bites. Her stomach loosened just a little. The diner's background sounds began to soften into something almost soothing. The clink of a fork. The hiss of the coffee pot. A low radio near the kitchen playing an old country song at a volume too low to catch the words. Outside the window, the street was dark, slick with damp. Light from the diner painted the sidewalk in a warm rectangle. Beyond that, the cold waited. Casey's phone buzzed in her bag, again muffled. She ignored it. She took a fry, dipped it in ketchup, and chewed slowly. For the first time since she had left the hospital, her mind stopped running numbers. At the counter, the older man finally spoke, so quiet, Casey almost missed it. He was not talking to anyone else. He was talking to Koa. "Easy," he murmured. Koa's head tilted slightly, then settled. The dog's body remained close to the man's boot, like the space between them had been measured and agreed upon long ago. Casey looked down at her plate and told herself to keep eating, to stay in her booth, to mind her own business. The bell above the door rang again. This time, the sound landed differently, sharper. The room's soft murmur shifted like a ripple moving through water. Casey's eyes lifted to the glass entrance. Two figures stepped inside, framed by cold air and streetlight, their voices already filling the space, before the door had fully closed. The bell's bright ring barely had time to fade before the two men took over the room with sound. They were both in their late 20s or early 30s, built like they liked being noticed. One wore a dark bomber jacket that still held the smell of cold smoke. The other had a hooded sweatshirt pulled up, even indoors, the fabric damp at the shoulders from mist outside. Their cheeks were flushed from the weather, or from whatever they had been doing before they pushed through the door. They talked like the diner was theirs, loud, overlapping, laughing at a joke that never quite landed. Casey stayed still in her booth sandwich, paused near her mouth. She watched them the way she watched a new patient in triage, not alarmed yet, just measuring. They did not look around for a table. They headed straight for the counter. The hooded one slid onto the stool, 2 seats away from Frank Delaney, close enough that their elbows nearly touched. The man in the bomber jacket took the seat on the other side, turning his body slightly, so Frank was boxed in without a hand ever being laid on him. Koa's head lifted. The dog did not bark. Its eyes tracked their hands, then their feet, then the space behind them, as if mapping exits. Frank did not turn at first. His shoulders tightened. The muscles along his jaw jumped once. The hooded one glanced down at Koa's vest and let out a low whistle that was meant to be heard. "Look at this," he said, voice thick with amusement. "They got dogs wearing tactical costumes now." The bomber jacket guy laughed sharp and short. "Man, that thing's ancient." Frank's coffee mug paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, careful, like he did not trust his hands to stay steady. The hooded one leaned forward, squinting at the stitched name. Ko, he read, drawing it out, wrong on purpose. That's supposed to mean something. Koa's ears flicked. The dog's body stayed pressed close to Frank's boot, but its tail went still. Frank stared at the counter. He did not look at them. He did not offer the satisfaction of a reaction. The bomber jacket guy tipped his chin toward Frank's cane, propped against the stool. "You need that to get to the bathroom, Grandpa?" he asked. His tone tried to sound casual. His eyes were bright with it. A few booths away, the man with the newspaper lowered it by an inch. Not enough to be obvious. Enough to see. The waitress still behind the counter slowed with the coffee pot in her hand. Her eyes narrowed, then softened when they landed on Frank. She set the pot down harder than necessary, a small thud that carried. "Gentlemen," she said, voice flat. "You ordering food, or just taking up space?" The hooded one smiled at her, like he thought charm could erase anything. "Relax, ma'am," he said. We're just talking. The waitress leaned closer, not intimidated, not loud. Then talked to each other. The bomber jacket guy glanced back at the kitchen window. The cook had stopped moving. One hand rested on the counter, the other on the handle of a knife he had been using for onions. He did not lift it. He did not need to. The bomber jacket guy turned back with a grin that tried to look easy. "We'll order," he said. "Coffee. Black." The hooded one didn't even look at the menu. And whatever's cheap, he added eyes still on Frank. They probably got a senior discount right. Frank's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. His knuckles went pale. Casey set her sandwich down. She could have kept eating. She could have kept her head down and let the waitress handle it. She had done that in other places, in other moments. Told herself it was not her job. Told herself she was too tired. But the sound in the room had changed. The air had gone thin. It reminded her of the seconds right before a code when everyone in the bay felt the shift, but no one said it yet. The hooded one nodded toward Koa. "Does it even do anything?" he asked. "Or is it like him, just sits there and looks tough?" Koa let out a soft whine. Not fear, protest. Frank's shoulders rose with a tight inhale. He swallowed. His gaze stayed pinned to the counter, as if it could hold him there. The bomber jacket guy leaned in closer, voice dropping to the kind of low meant to feel private. "You miss it?" he asked Frank. "The attention, being somebody." Frank's jaw clenched. A tendon stood out along his neck. Casey felt heat rise behind her eyes. Not rage, exactly. Something colder. The kind of anger that came from watching someone cornered when all they wanted was quiet. She slid out of her booth. Her legs felt heavy, but her balance was sure. Her shoes made a soft sound on the tile. She walked to the counter and stopped a few feet behind the hooded one. Close enough to be heard, far enough not to be touched. "Hey," Casey said. The word cut through their laughter as like a switch flipping. Both men turned. They looked her up and down. Jeans, hoodie, hospital badge missing, but the faint outlines on her wrists and the way her hair was tied back still gave her away. The bomber jacket guy's smile widened. It was not friendly. What he asked. Casey kept her voice level. "Leave him alone." The hooded one blinked like he had not expected resistance from a woman in a diner booth. "This is not your business," he said. Casey nodded once, as if considering it. Then she said, "It is now." The bomber jacket guy laughed again, louder this time, trying to pull the room back into his control. "Look at you," he said. "You his granddaughter, or something?" Casey's eyes did not move from his. "No." "Then sit down," the hooded one said. "Eat your grilled cheese. Let the grown-ups talk." Casey's mouth tightened. She glanced at Frank for the first time since she stood. He stared straight ahead, face carved into stillness. The skin around his eyes looked strained, like he was holding something back by force. Koa looked up at Casey. The dog's gaze held hers for a beat. Then it shifted back to the men watchful. Casey faced them again. "You're not talking," she said. "You're hunting for a reaction, because you think it makes you bigger." The bomber jacket guy's smile faltered, just a hair. Enough to show the truth under it. He leaned back on his stool. "You got a mouth," he said. "You always run it like this." Casey shrugged. "Only when I see people picking on someone who cannot be bothered to fight you." The hooded one's jaw worked. He glanced around the diner, noticing the eyes on him now. The couple in the booth had gone still. The man with the newspaper had lowered it completely. Even the waitress had stopped moving her hands planted on the counter. Silence is a kind of pressure. It filled the space between Casey and the two men. The bomber jacket guy tipped his head, studying her. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he asked. Casey did not answer right away. She thought about the ER, about the boy with the crooked cannula, about the woman staring into a plastic basin, about the monitor tone that stretched too long earlier, about how helplessness sat in her chest like a stone. She let none of it show. "I think you're being cruel," she said. "And I'm asking you to stop." The hooded one's eyes narrowed. Asking, he repeated like it was funny. Casey held his gaze. "Yes." For a moment, no one moved. Then, the bomber jacket guy slapped his palm on the counter, hard enough to rattle the sugar dispenser. "Fine," he said loud. "We get it. The nurse lady wants to play cop." Casey's stomach tightened at the word nurse. He had said it like an insult, like care was weakness. The waitress stepped forward, coffee pot in hand. "You're done," she said. The bomber jacket guy looked at her, then at Casey. Something in his expression shifted. It was small, but Casey saw it clearly. A choice made in anger, a need to take something back. He slid off the stool. His boots hit the tile with a dull thud. He towered closer than he needed to, invading space, the way a bully always does, making the body decide whether to flinch. Casey did not step back. The hooded one stood too slower, eyes flicking between Casey and the cook's window, where the cook still did not move. The knife remained on the counter plane, invisible, a reminder, without a threat. "All right," the bomber jacket guy said. His voice had gone quieter now. "That was worse. We're leaving." He turned as if to go, then stopped beside Casey's shoulder. He leaned in close enough that Casey smelled the stale smoke on his clothes, the faint sweetness of cheap alcohol under it. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "You should have stayed in your booth," he said. Casey kept her eyes forward. She did not give him the satisfaction of flinching or turning her head. She spoke without raising her voice. "You're still here," she said. A breath passed. The bomber jacket guy's lips pressed together. Then he straightened. He walked toward the door. The hooded one followed slower eyes, lingering on Frank one last time. He smirked, as if promising the room he could come back whenever he wanted. The bell rang as they shoved the door open. Cold air poured in. The neon outside flickered against their backs. Then the door swung shut, and the bell rang again, softer, settling. For a beat, no one moved. The diner held its breath. Casey felt her heart in her throat. She did not like how steady her hands were. She did not like how familiar this felt, the moment after a confrontation, when your body realizes you have stepped into something you cannot unstep from. Behind her, the waitress exhaled sharply. The sound, half irritation, half relief. "You all right?" the waitress asked Casey. Casey nodded once, not trusting her voice yet. She turned slightly toward Frank. He still stared at the counter. His face had gone tight around the eyes, like he had been looking at something bright for too long. His hand rested on Koa's head again, fingers pressing into fur, as if to confirm the dog was real. Koa's ears were still up. The dog's gaze stayed locked on the door, alert, waiting for the sound of boots returning. Frank finally turned his head, just enough to look at Casey, without fully facing her. His eyes were wet, but he did not let the tears fall. Pride held them back like a dam. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough. The word sounded old-fashioned, like habit. "You didn't have to do that." Casey swallowed. "Yes," she said. "I did." Frank's throat worked. He looked down at his coffee mug, then back at Casey. "Thank you," he said quieter. Casey gave a small nod, as if it was nothing. Her body did not agree. Her pulse still ran fast under her skin. The waitress picked up the coffee pot again and poured for Frank with a steadiness that looked practiced. "Eat your food," she muttered to Casey. "Don't let idiots ruin it." Casey turned and walked back to her booth. Her legs felt a shade less heavy, now lit by adrenaline instead of exhaustion. She sat down and picked up her sandwich. The cheese had cooled. The bread was less crisp. She took a bite anyway. Across the diner, conversation tried to restart tentative, like someone easing back into a song after a wrong note. Forks scraped. A chair squeaked. The radio near the kitchen played, on its low melody, thin but persistent. Casey kept her gaze on the window for a moment. The street outside looked the same as it had before. Wet pavement, dim light, no sign of the two men. Her phone buzzed once in her bag, muffled. She ignored it. She forced herself to chew slow and steady. At the counter, Frank lifted his mug again. His hand shook just enough for the coffee to ripple. Koa stayed pressed close to his boot, eyes still fixed on the door body, quiet as a held breath. Koa did not stop watching the door. Casey tried to pretend that did not matter. She sat in her booth and ate because the waitress had told her to. She chewed because her body needed it. She swallowed because it was easier than feeling her throat tighten with every small sound. The radio kept playing low and tinny. The kitchen vent hummed. A fork clinked against a plate and made Casey's shoulders jump before she could stop them. She hated that. She hated how the hospital followed her into places that were supposed to be ordinary. Across the room, the man with the newspaper raised it again, but he held it too high like a shield. The couple at the far booth leaned close to each other and spoke in voices meant to stay private. Their eyes kept sliding toward the door anyway. Frank Delaney sat at the counter like he had been nailed there. His coffee had gone darker and cooler. He did not drink it. His hand stayed on Koa's head, fingers spread through fur with a steady pressure that looked calm from a distance and desperate up close. Casey took another bite of grilled cheese. The bread was soft now. The cheese had thickened. She kept eating anyway, slower this time, listening for boots that did not come back. The waitress moved between booths with a tray balanced on her palm. She spoke to customers like she had known them for years. Her voice stayed normal, but her eyes were sharp. Every time the bell above the door made the slightest rattle from the wind, she glanced up. She passed Casey's booth and paused long enough to top off Casey's mug. "You okay, honey?" she asked, as if she had only just noticed Casey's tight grip on the cup. Casey nodded. "I'm fine." The waitress's mouth pressed into a thin line that said she did not believe the word fine any more than Casey did. She leaned closer and lowered her voice. "You want me to call somebody?" she asked. "Police, maybe." Casey's first instinct was to say no. Not because she thought those men deserved mercy, but because she could already picture the questions, the paperwork, the way it dragged. She could already hear Brooke's voice in her head telling her not to disappear into it. Before Casey answered, Frank spoke without turning his head. "No," he said. His voice was quiet, but firm. It carried anyway. "No police." The waitress looked at him. Her expression softened, then tightened again. She looked like she wanted to argue, but she swallowed it. "All right," she said, "but you don't step out alone." Frank's jaw shifted. Pride rose in him like a reflex. He did not look at her, but his shoulders went rigid. "I can handle myself," he said. The waitress gave a short, humorless laugh. "Sure you can. That's why you were sitting there, letting two fools use you for entertainment." Frank's hand paused on Koa's head. The dog's ears tilted back, catching the sharp edge in her tone. Frank exhaled through his nose. "You don't know me," he said. The waitress tapped the counter with one knuckle. "I know enough," she said. Then she looked at Casey again. "You finish eating." She walked away, leaving the air behind her, slightly warmer from the heat of her irritation. Casey watched Frank in the reflection of the window. His face had gone still, but his eyes were tired. She recognized that kind of tired. It was the tired that came from holding yourself upright when no one was looking. Her phone buzzed inside her bay. The vibration made a soft thrum against the fabric. Casey reached in and pulled it out more to make the buzzing stop than from curiosity. A text from Brooke lit the screen. "You home yet?" Casey stared at the words until they blurred. "Not yet," she typed back. "Getting food." She hesitated, then added another line. "I'm okay." She sent it before she could overthink it. The message whooshed away and left her with the same silence, only now it had a shape. She tucked the phone back into her bag and forced herself to eat a few more fries. The ketchup had dried at the edges. The salt was too much. Her stomach accepted it anyway, grudgingly. At the counter, Frank's coffee remained untouched. Koa's gaze stayed locked on the entrance. The dog's body was quiet, but there was a tension in the shoulders that did not belong in a diner. Casey had seen that posture on human beings in waiting rooms, in hallways, outside trauma bays. A stillness that meant the mind was already counting exits. Frank shifted on his stool and glanced down at his cane. His fingers tightened around the curved handle, then loosened, like he was testing whether his hands still worked. Casey pushed her plate away. There was food left, but her appetite had run out. She picked up her mug and drank the last of her coffee. It had cooled, but it still tasted like something grounding. She slid out of her booth, the vinyl making a faint squeak, and walked toward the counter. Frank looked up when she stopped a few feet away. His eyes were red around the rims. He did not look like a man who wanted help. He looked like a man who wanted the world to stop noticing him. Casey kept her voice neutral. "You headed out." Frank stared at her for a beat measuring. Then he nodded once. "Yes," he said. Casey glanced down at Koa. The dog's eyes flicked to her, then back to the door. The vest's Velcro edge curled slightly, a tired corner lifting away from the fabric. Casey had the urge to press it down to fix something small. She did not touch it. "Where are you parked?" she asked. Frank's mouth tightened. "Around the corner." Casey's eyes went to his cane again. She did the math without meaning to. Distance, balance, reaction time. She pictured those men outside in the cold, their laughter in the doorway. "Mind if I walk with you?" she asked. Frank's head snapped a fraction toward her surprise. First, then that same stubborn pride. "No," he said quickly. "You've done enough." Casey held his gaze. "It's cold out." "I've been cold before," Frank said. Casey heard the subtext under it. "I have survived things you do not understand. I do not need your pity." She kept her voice steady. "I'm not offering pity," she said. "I'm offering company." Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked like he wanted to refuse, just on principle. Then, Koa's head lifted higher, ears forward, eyes fixed on the door as if it could see through it. Frank followed the dog's gaze and swallowed. "All right," he said the word reluctant. "To the corner." Casey nodded once, like it was settled and not a concession. The waitress came around the counter with a clean rag in her hand. She stopped when she saw Casey beside Frank. "You going?" she asked Frank. Frank nodded. The waitress's eyes slid to Casey. There was something like relief in them, sharp and brief. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small paper bag. "Take this," she said to Casey, pressing the bag into her hand. "For the road, don't argue." Casey looked down. Inside the bag, warm through the paper, was a wrapped slice of pie. The smell of cinnamon rose faintly. Casey's throat tightened. "Thank you," she said. The waitress's expression softened just enough to make her look younger. "Go on," she said, "and keep your head up." Frank slid off the stool carefully. His knees complained in the way his face refused to. He steadied himself with the cane and gave the waitress a brief nod, as if gratitude was something he could only offer in small amounts. Koa stood smoothly, no hesitation, and moved into position beside Frank's leg. The dog pressed close, shoulder brushing Frank's shin, a living brace. Casey walked beside them toward the door. The diner felt warmer than it had when she entered, or maybe she was only more aware of the cold waiting outside. When Casey pushed the door open, the bell rang clear and bright. Cold air rushed in hard. It smelled like wet steel and river salt. Casey stepped out first, boots finding slick pavement. She glanced left and right down the street. The sidewalk glistened under the streetlights. Water pooled in shallow dents. The neon sign above the diner buzzed and flickered, painting red light across their faces for half a second at a time. The sound of traffic on the main road was distant, softened by the mist. Frank stepped out behind her. He pulled his coat tighter. His breath came out in a thick plume. Koa's paws touched the pavement, and the dog froze for a beat, head angled, listening. The dog's nose lifted slightly, tasting the air. Casey closed the door gently. The bell rang again softer this time, then fell silent. They started walking. Frank moved with careful measured steps, cane tapping a steady rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. It was not slow exactly. It was controlled. He walked like he refused to be hurried. Casey matched his pace. She kept herself on the side, closer to the street, not in a dramatic way, just enough that her body formed a barrier without needing to announce it. "You shouldn't have said anything in there," Frank muttered after a few steps. Casey looked at him. "You wanted them to keep going." Frank's jaw worked. "No." Then Casey said and let the word hang. Frank's eyes stayed on the sidewalk ahead. "I'm not worth getting dragged into trouble," he said quieter. Casey felt something twist in her chest. She kept her voice calm. "You're a person," she said. "That's enough." Frank gave a short laugh that held no humor. "People don't treat you like that when you look like me." Casey did not respond right away. She watched his hand on the cane, the skin tough and cracked. She watched the way his shoulders held a burden he refused to name. She had seen men like him come into the hospital silent, through pain that would make other people scream. Men who apologized for bleeding on the floor. "You don't know what I look like on the inside," Casey said. Frank glanced at her just once. There was something in his eyes that almost softened, then snapped back into guardedness. "You work at Bayview," he said. "Not a question." Casey nodded. "I could tell," Frank said. "Your hands. The way you stand." Casey's fingers flexed inside her sleeves. "And you," she said. Frank's face tightened. "No," he said. "Don't." Casey understood. He did not want to be recognized. Not as a story. Not as a symbol. Not as someone people whispered about. "All right," she said simply. They walked on in silence for a few yards. The only sounds were cane taps, Koa's nails, clicking lightly against the wet pavement, and the far-off rumble of a truck shifting gears. Casey felt the city around them, Norfolk at night, the low industrial hum from the shipyards, the occasional cry of a bird that sounded lost in the fog, the smell of diesel rising from a storm drain. They reached the corner where the side street met a narrower lane between two brick buildings. The lane was darker, the street light farther away. A security light above a back door flickered, then steadied. And Frank slowed. Koa's body tightened. The dog's head turned toward the lane ears, fully forward now. Casey felt it too, that shift in the air. A pressure, like the moment before a door opens in the ER, and you know the patient behind it is going to change your entire night. Frank stopped and looked down the lane. His breath hitched. He gripped his cane hard enough that his knuckles went white. Casey followed his gaze. Two figures leaned against the brick, half hidden in shadow. The glow from a distant streetlight caught the edge of a jacket. A pale hand moved, then disappeared into a pocket. Koa let out a low sound from deep in its chest. Not a bark, not a whine, a warning. Casey's hand tightened around the small paper bag the waitress had given her. The pie inside was still warm, absurdly, so as if the world had not noticed the cold. The figures in the shadows straightened. One of them shifted his weight forward, a casual motion that did not reach his eyes. Frank's voice came out rough. "No," he said, barely louder than breath. Casey stepped slightly in front of him, her body moving on instinct, eyes fixed on the dark, as the men began to walk toward them. The two men came out of the shadow, like they belonged there. Troy moved first, shoulders loose, hands deep in his jacket pockets. Nash followed half a step behind, head tilted, as if he was enjoying the shape of Frank's fear. The security light above the back door flickered again and steadied, throwing a hard white wash across the brick and leaving the lane beyond it darker by comparison. Casey held her ground. The paper bag in her fist crinkled softly. Warm pie cinnamon and sugar, a ridiculous smell to have in a moment like this. Frank's cane trembled once, then steadied as he tightened his grip. His breath came out in a thin rasp. "Go home," Casey said. Her voice sounded calm, which surprised her. Troy's mouth curled. "You really like telling people what to do?" Nash laughed under his breath. It did not sound amused. It sounded hungry. Koa shifted closer to Frank's leg shoulder, pressed to bone. The dog's low warning grew louder, vibrating through its chest. Not a bark yet, a promise. Troy stopped a few feet away, close enough that Casey could smell him, now that stale mix of smoke and cheap liquor trapped in fabric. "Look at you," Troy said. "Still playing hero." Casey kept her eyes on his hands. Pockets were easy places to hide a weapon. She had seen it too many times in the ER. A blade carried like a secret. A gun tucked into a waistband. The way violence always arrived faster than you expected. "You got what you wanted," she said. "You got the last word. Walk away." Nash's grin widened. "Nah." Frank's voice cracked. "Leave it," he said, aimed at Casey more than them. "Just leave it." Casey did not look back at him. She could feel him behind her, the weight of him, the fragile balance of his body in the cold. If she turned, she would give Troy the opening he wanted. Troy's eyes flicked past Casey to Frank. His gaze lingered on the cane, on the hunched shoulders, on the dog's vest. "You think you can hide behind her?" he asked Frank. Frank's jaw clenched. "I'm not hiding." Troy snorted. "Sure." Casey heard it before she saw it. The subtle change in fabric, the shift of a hand inside a pocket. The sound was small, but her body reacted like a siren had gone off. "Troy," Nash said, almost bored, as if reminding him to hurry. Troy's right hand came out. The blade caught the security light and threw it back in a sharp flash. Casey moved without thinking. Not a plan, not bravery, a reflex that came from 1,000 nights stepping into danger because someone had to. She shoved Frank backward with her left arm hard enough that his coat scraped the brick. The cane clattered against the pavement. Frank stumbled, grabbing for balance. Koa lunged forward, at the same time teeth bared, but Casey's body crossed the space first. "Run," she said, but the word came out thin. Troy surged. Casey twisted, trying to angle away, but the lane was narrow and slick. Her boot slipped on wet pavement. Pain bloomed in her right side, bright and immediate, so sharp it stole the air from her lungs. For a second, she did not understand what it was. Then, she felt warmth spreading under her sweatshirt. Troy yanked the knife free. His face was close enough for Casey to see the pores on his skin, the blankness in his eyes. Nash moved in. Casey heard his breath fast and excited. Koa snarled and snapped at Troy's arm. Troy kicked out, catching the dog in the shoulder. Koa skidded claws, scraping, then scrambled back up, anger undimmed. Frank made a sound that was half a shout and half a broken plea. "No, no." Casey tried to step forward anyway. Her legs did not want to listen. Her hand went instinctively to her side, pressing hard. The pressure should have helped. It did not. Troy came again. The second stab hit lower. A dull punch, then fire. Casey's vision sparked white at the edges. She swung her left arm more to block than to fight. Her forearm smacked Troy's wrist. The blade sliced air and then found her again, a third time, quick and close, like he was angry at how long it was taking. Casey heard herself make a noise she did not recognize. Something small, an animal. Nash grabbed her shoulder from behind and yanked. The motion spun her off balance. The lane tilted. The security light above flashed brighter and then dimmer as her head moved. Casey saw Frank against the brick eyes, wide hands out, as if he could catch the moment before it happened. She saw Koa launch again, barking now, the sound furious and desperate. Troy's arm rose. The blade dropped. The fourth strike drove Casey's knees toward the ground. Her body folded around the pain. The pavement hit her kneecaps through denim shock and cold. She tasted metal, not from the air, from her own mouth. Somewhere a car turned onto the side street. Headlights swept across the mouth of the lane, weak at first, then brighter. Tires hissed on wet asphalt. A horn blared once startled. Troy's head snapped toward the light. His face tightened annoyance, flashing into caution. Nash swore. Go. Troy's eyes came back to Casey, and for a moment, there was a choice there. Something ugly and final. He drove the knife in again, the 5th time, and Casey felt the world shrink to a single point of heat. Then Troy yanked the blade free and stepped back. Koa lunged at his leg and caught fabric. Troy kicked again harder. Koa yelped, the sound cracking through the cold, but the dog did not retreat. It snapped again, teeth flashing. Move, Nash hissed. They ran. Boots splashed through shallow water. Their shadows flickered, stretched by headlights. Then they were gone, swallowed by the darker street beyond the lane. Casey stayed on her knees for a beat, hands pressed to her side, trying to hold herself together with force. Her fingers came away slick and hot. Frank was shouting her name. The sound was ragged, the voice of a man who had learned too late what it meant to need help. Miss, look at me, he said. But his own eyes were wild, unable to focus. Casey tried to answer. Her lips parted. Only air came out. Koa stood between Casey and the mouth of the lane, barking toward the street like it could call the attackers back into the light and make them face what they had done. The dog's body trembled, chest heaving. One front paw held slightly off the ground, a small limp, but the dog stayed upright. A car had stopped at the curb. A man climbed out, phone in hand, his voice loud with fear. Call 911, he shouted to someone inside. Now! A woman's voice answered from the passenger seat, already speaking to an operator. We need an ambulance. She's bleeding. The man ran toward them, then hesitated, eyes dropping to the blood spreading across Casey's sweatshirt. Then to the knife wounds. Then to the dog, barking like a siren with teeth. Frank waved him in, desperate. Help her, please. The man took a careful step closer. Ma'am, can you hear me? Casey blinked slowly. The lane seemed too bright now. The security light above buzzed. The world had narrowed to sounds and shapes. Frank's coat, Koa's vest. The paper bag with pie crushed under her palm, warm, still absurdly warm. She tried to breathe and felt something shift inside her abdomen. Pain surged again, and the edges of her vision went dark. Stay with me, the man said louder. His hands hovered, unsure where to touch. I'm going to put pressure here, okay? Casey wanted to tell him where. She wanted to say lower right, under the ribs, watch the bleeding. She wanted to give him instructions like she always did. Her tongue felt thick. Her throat closed around the words. Frank dropped down beside her with a stiffness that made him grunt. He fumbled with his coat, tried to press the fabric against Casey's side, hands shaking too hard to be useful. I'm sorry, he said, voice breaking. I'm sorry. Koa whined and pressed close, nose nudging Casey's knee, then her hand, then her side confused by the blood and the stillness. Casey's hand lifted slow and heavy and brushed the dog's fur once. She felt warmth and grit under her fingertips. She tried to hold on to that sensation, tried to anchor herself to something real. Sirens rose in the distance, faint at first, then louder. The sound cut through the night and pulled the street into attention. A porch light clicked on somewhere. A door opened. Someone shouted from an upstairs window. The man with the phone stepped back to wave the ambulance in. Here, over here. Frank stayed close to Casey's face, his eyes pleading. Don't you go, he said. Don't. Casey blinked again. The security light above streaked into a long smear. Her hearing dulled as if cotton had been shoved into her ears. The sirens became a far-off wail. Then the ambulance swung into view. Red lights washing the brick walls, blue light sliding over Frank's face, over Koa's vest, over Casey's hands. 2 paramedics jumped out fast, bags in hand, their movements sharp and practiced. One knelt at Casey's side and spoke in a calm voice that sounded like control. Hey, can you look at me? The paramedic said. What's your name? Casey's lips moved. The word did not make it out. The other paramedic cut her sweatshirt with trauma shears, fabric ripping open to expose dark, wet patches. Cold air hit her skin. The paramedic's gloved hand pressed down hard. Multiple stab wounds, the paramedic said, voice clipped. She's pale. She's going out. Frank reached for Casey's shoulder, then stopped, hands hovering, because he did not know where he was allowed to touch. She works at Bayview, Frank blurted. She's a nurse. She stepped in front of him. She saved me. The paramedic did not look up. Sir, I need you back. I'm not leaving her, Frank said, voice rising. A third responder moved in, a firefighter, broad and steady. He placed a hand on Frank's shoulder, firm, but not rough. "You can come to the hospital," he said, "but you need to give them space." Frank's eyes locked on Casey's face. "Casey," he said, tasting the name like it could keep her here. "Please." Casey tried to focus on him. His face swam. The lines in his skin blurred. The air in her lungs felt thin. Each inhale was a struggle against something heavy inside her. Koa barked again, then whined, then barked, the sound cracking with panic. The dog paced in a tight circle, then sat hard on its haunches beside Frank, as if deciding it would not move. The paramedic slid an oxygen mask over Casey's face. Plastic pressed against her cheeks. The smell of rubber and sterile air filled her nose. "Stay with me," the paramedic said again, close to her ear. "You're doing good. Keep your eyes open." Casey's eyelids fluttered. The red and blue lights outside turned into slow waves. The cold air and the scent of cinnamon from the crushed pie mixed with blood and exhaust. The responders lifted her onto a stretcher. The motion made her wounds scream. Casey's back arched involuntarily, then fell flat. Straps tightened across her chest and hips. Frank leaned in close enough that Casey felt his breath warm against her temple. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm right here." The stretcher rolled. Wheels clacked over cracks in the pavement. Casey's head turned slightly, and she caught one last clear image. Frank standing in the lane with his cane in one hand, and Koa pressed against his leg. Both of them lit by flashing ambulance lights. Then the doors of the ambulance closed. Inside, the space was tight and bright. The ceiling lights hummed. The paramedic's hands moved fast, checking pressure, finding a vein, calling numbers to the driver through a radio. Casey tried to breathe around the oxygen. The mask fogged with each exhale. Her fingers twitched, searching for the edge of the stretcher for something to hold. The siren rose again as the ambulance lurched forward. Casey watched the light fixtures overhead blur into streaks. Her hearing narrowed until she could only catch fragments. "Pressure dropping. Keep pressure on it. Stay with me." Casey's eyes slid shut. When she forced them open again, she saw bright white lights through the small rear windows in the blurred shape of the hospital entrance as the ambulance backed in. The vehicle stopped hard. The back doors opened. Cold air rushed in. Voices snapped into sharper focus. "Stabbing," someone said. 5 wounds. Abdomen and flank. They rolled her out into the night air and under the harsh lights of the ambulance bay. The smell of the river vanished, replaced by disinfectant and exhaust, in the clean, sterile bite of a hospital that never slept. Bayview's automatic doors slid open. The stretcher wheels hit tile, and the sound echoed. Bright light swallowed Casey whole. It came from every direction, hard and clean, the kind that made faces look washed out and honest. The air changed too. No river salt, no wet brick, only disinfectant and plastic, and the faint sting of something burnt on a heating element. "Trauma 1, a voice called out. Hands guided the stretcher through swinging doors. A nurse jogged alongside with a clipboard, already in motion, hair pulled tight, eyes sharp. Someone shoved a curtain aside. Someone else cleared a path with a palm held out like a stop sign. Casey's eyes fluttered. The ceiling tiles slid past in a blur. She tried to focus on a single square, on a single stain, on any small detail that could keep the room from tipping away. "Casey Monroe," a paramedic said, speaking fast. "Female, 27. Multiple stab wounds. 5 total. Abdomen and right flank. Significant blood loss. Pressure dropping in the field. Oxygen on. 2 large bore lines attempted one in place." A doctor stepped in close, her voice crisp. "Casey, can you hear me?" Casey tried to nod. Her neck refused. The mask pressed against her face, warm with her own breath. "We need an ultrasound now," the doctor said. "Get blood ready. Activate massive transfusion." A nurse snapped open packets with practiced violence. Tape, gauze, alcohol swabs. The smell hit sharp and familiar. Casey's mind reached for work, for protocols, for what comes next in a bay like this. Someone peeled the oxygen mask away for a second to replace it with another. Cold air hit her lips. She tasted iron and bile. "Her airway is intact," a voice said, "but she is getting tired." "Jace, you here?" another voice called. A beat later, Jace Rivera pushed through the crowd with a respiratory bag in his hand, hair still damp, like he had just come in from outside. His eyes landed on the patient and widened a fraction before he locked them down. "Yeah," he said. "I got it." He leaned in, close to Casey's face. Not gentle, not rough, efficient. His hands adjusted the mask seal. He spoke low enough that the chaos around them did not swallow it. "Hey," Jace said. "It's me. You stay with us, okay?" Casey wanted to answer. Her throat made a dry sound that barely counted as voice. A nurse threaded a needle into her arm. The prick was small compared to everything else, but it anchored her. She flinched anyway. "Sorry," the nurse muttered, then glanced at Casey's face. Recognition flashed in her eyes, like a light flicking on. "Oh my God." Another nurse heard it and looked. "Is that Casey?" The room shifted, not in action, but in energy. The same hands kept moving, but their urgency tightened. "Don't do that," the doctor snapped, not unkindly. "Stay focused." Casey's eyelids drooped. She heard her name again, repeated by different voices, each one carrying a different shade of fear. "Pressure is 80 systolic," someone said. "Give a unit now," the doctor said. 2 units. "Keep it coming." A blood bag appeared above her, red and heavy, swinging slightly on the hook as it was spiked. The line filled dark fluid, sliding toward her, like a promise. A portable ultrasound probe pressed into her abdomen. The touch made her teeth clench. She tried to breathe through it. Her breath caught. "Free fluid," the doctor said. "Call the OR," someone replied. Casey's vision tunneled. She could still hear the monitor, the steady beep that belonged to her, thin and fast. Each beep felt like a footstep on ice. "Where was she stabbed? A nurse?" asked the paramedic. "Outside Harbor Light Diner," the paramedic said. 2 attackers fled. Witnesses called it in. A veteran was with her. The word veteran cut through the fog for Casey. She saw Frank's face, for a second, lit by ambulance lights, his hands shaking. Koa barking until the sound cracked. Casey tried to say his name. Frank. Or the dog's. "Koa." The word stayed trapped behind the mask. Someone cut away the remaining fabric of her sweatshirt. Cold air spilled onto her skin. Her side burned where pressure was being held. The pain came in waves, and each wave seemed to pull her farther away from the room. A nurse leaned over her and spoke loudly, voice bright and forced. "Casey, look at me. Squeeze my hand." Casey's fingers twitched. A weak squeeze. The nurse's eyes filled, then she blinked hard and turned away to hide it. "Transport," the doctor ordered, "now." The stretcher surged forward again. The ceiling tiles resumed their blur. The doors to the operating suite opened with a hiss like a seal breaking. The air inside felt colder, drier. The lights were even brighter. Casey's mind snagged on a detail. Someone had taped a strip of paper to the wall near the OR doors with the shift's patient list. The handwriting was messy, familiar. Brooke's handwriting. A second later, Brooke Patel appeared at the edge of the corridor, jacket, half on hair, loose cheeks, flushed from running. She looked like she had thrown clothes over sleep and sprinted straight from her car. "Where is she?" Brooke demanded. A nurse caught her by the elbow. "Brooke, you cannot go in." Brooke's gaze found the stretcher. It was like watching her get punched. "No," Brooke whispered, then louder. "Casey." Casey turned her eyes toward Brooke. The movement made nausea surge. Brooke's face swam, but her eyes were clear and wide, shining with panic that had nowhere to go. Brooke moved closer until the nurse held her back again. "I'm here," Brooke said, voice shaking. She tried to smile and failed. Hey, you stubborn jerk." Casey wanted to laugh. It would have hurt too much. She wanted to tell Brooke to stop looking like that. She wanted to say she was fine. The word "fine" hovered and then dissolved. The OR doors swung open. A surgical tech took control of the stretcher and guided it in. Brooke called after her, "Stay, please." Then the doors shut, and Brooke was left staring at a blank wall that had just taken her friend away. Inside, everything moved fast and sharp. Casey was shifted from stretcher to operating table. Cold metal pressed her back, straps tightened. A nurse's hands held her head steady while someone started another line. A surgeon stood at her side, already gloved, already focused eyes on the damage and not the person. "Intubate," the anesthesiologist said. Jace was there, mask on, eyes steady. He squeezed Casey's shoulder, once a small pressure, through fabric and chaos. "Count backward for me," the anesthesiologist said. Casey tried. 10, 9. Her thoughts slipped sideways. The lights above smeared into a white lake. Her body felt heavy, then suddenly light, as if it no longer belonged to her. The room fell away. Outside the OR, Brooke paced the corridor until her steps turned ragged. She stopped, pressed her palms to her eyes, then dropped her hands and kept moving. A nurse offered her water. Brooke did not take it. Jace came out once, mask hanging at his neck, eyes tired. "She is in there," he said. "They're working." Brooke gripped his sleeve. "How bad?" Jace's throat moved as he swallowed. "Bad." Brooke released him and leaned her shoulder against the wall. The tile felt cold through her jacket. She slid down until she was sitting on the floor, knees drawn up, staring at the OR doors, as if staring could pry them open. Downstairs, the emergency department kept taking patients. It did not stop for anyone. A code alarm sounded in another hallway and was silenced. A baby cried somewhere on the pediatric side. The hospital ran on its own track, unstoppable. In the waiting area, outside the secured ICU doors, Frank Delaney arrived with Koa at his side. A security guard met him and held up a hand. "Sir, visiting hours are over." Frank looked smaller here than he had in the diner. Not because his body changed, but because the hospital had a way of doing that to people. Its walls were too clean, its lights too bright, its rules too absolute. "I need to see her," Frank said. The guard's eyes moved to Koa's vest, the worn Velcro, the faded patch, the dog's steady stare. "Who are you to her?" the guard asked. Frank's jaw tightened. He did not have a good answer. He was not family by paperwork. Not a spouse, not a brother, not a son. He was the man she had stepped in front of a knife for. Frank opened his mouth and then closed it. A nurse stepped out of the ICU area, saw Frank, and paused. She looked at his face and understood something without being told. "I saw it come through," the nurse said quietly. "Casey Monroe." Frank nodded once sharp. "She is in surgery," the nurse said. "They are trying." Frank's hand went to the glass of the secured doors, like he could steady himself on it. Koa pressed against his shin and sat body still, eyes tracking the nurse. Frank's voice came out hoarse. "I did this." The nurse did not argue. She did not comfort him with words that would bounce off. She only said, "Stay here." Frank stayed. The hospital had its own small currents. People moving between floors, between units, between grief and work. In that current, news traveled. A housekeeping worker pushed a cart past the ICU doors and looked at Frank and Koa. His eyes narrowed. He slowed. "That dog," he said, almost to himself. Frank looked up wary. The worker crouched a little, not close enough to touch, but close enough to see the name on the vest. "Koa," he read. His expression changed. Something softened, then sharpened into attention. "No kidding." He straightened and pulled out his phone, with hands that suddenly seemed less tired. A few minutes later, in a break room on another floor, a man with a navy haircut looked at a text and went still. He stared at the screen, then at the person across from him, then back at the screen again. "What is it?" the other person asked. The man held the phone out. The message was simple, stripped of drama. "Koa is at Bayview. Retired MWD. A nurse got stabbed, protecting him and his handler." The man's jaw clenched. He typed a reply with thumbs that moved fast. "Is she alive?" Back in the corridor, outside the OR, Brooke's phone buzzed. She stared at it like she did not recognize the device. Then she swiped it open. A coworker had sent a short message. "Casey is in surgery. It was a stabbing." She was defending an older vet and his dog. Brooke's breath hitched. She looked toward the ICU area as if she could see through floors. She typed without thinking. Who was with her? The response came. Frank Delaney. Dog named Koa. Brooke read the words twice. Then she looked up at Jace, who had returned to the corridor, face drawn tight. "The dog," Brooke said. Her voice cracked on the last word. It was a military dog. Jace's eyes narrowed. He did not ask why that mattered. He knew Norfolk. He knew how the river carried ships and secrets, and people who did not let go of their own. In the OR, the surgeon's voice rose over the steady machine noises. "She is bleeding again. Clamp. Now." Suction roared. Metal instruments clinked into trays. A nurse wiped sweat from the surgeon's forehead with a folded gauze, gentle and quick. "Pressure," the anesthesiologist asked. Dropping someone answered. "More blood," the surgeon said. "Keep it coming." Time stretched into something thick and strange. Hours did not behave like hours in a hallway outside an operating room. They became a series of door openings and closings, a series of faces, passing a series of phones, buzzing with messages that never felt like enough. Frank did not sit. When his knees threatened to buckle, he leaned harder on his cane. Koa remained at his feet, head lifted, eyes flicking toward every set of footsteps that approached. Near midnight, older men began to appear near the waiting area. Leather jackets, caps with patches that had been faded by sun and salt, hands that looked like Frank's. They nodded at him without asking questions. They took up spots along the wall as if the corridor belonged to them for this one purpose. Frank's eyes moved over them, and he swallowed. "You called them," he whispered, not accusing, only stunned. One of the men, gray at the temples, shrugged once. Word got around. Frank's mouth tightened. He looked away. Inside the OR, the surgeon finally stepped back, shoulders sagging. "Okay," she said, voice exhausted. "We have control for now." The anesthesiologist checked the monitor and nodded once slow. "Get her to intensive care," the surgeon ordered. "Now." The doors opened again, and Casey's bed rolled out sheets, pulled tight tubes, and lines snaking from her body into machines that beeped and hissed. Brooke surged to her feet. She stumbled forward, then stopped short at the sight of Casey's face, pale and slack, a tube at her mouth tape on her cheeks. "She is alive," Jace said, as if he needed to hear himself say it.
So, boy, bien. Barley.
Brooke walked alongside for 3 steps until the ICU doors blocked her. She pressed her hands to the glass, breath fogging the surface. On the other side, nurses moved with calm speed, connecting lines, checking pupils, adjusting drips. Machines took over what Casey's body could not do. The monitor beeped in a thinner rhythm now, but it was steady enough to keep the air in the room from breaking. Frank stepped forward, cane forgotten at his side. He placed his palm on the glass beside Brooke's, the two of them separated from Casey by a barrier that felt too thin and too cruel. Koa sat at Frank's feet, eyes fixed on the bed, ears forward. No one spoke for a long moment. The only sound was the steady, patient beep coming from the other side of the door. Brooke kept her palm against the glass until her fingers went numb. When she finally lowered her hand, a faint print of skin oil remained, a smudge that looked too human against the hospital's clean shine. Frank did not move. His breath fogged the glass in slow puffs. Koa stayed seated, eyes fixed through the narrow window panel, ears forward, body held tight, as if waiting for a command that never came. A nurse slipped out of the ICU and spoke softly to Brooke without meeting her eyes. "Vitals are holding," she said. "Not great. Holding." Brooke nodded, throat tight. She wanted numbers. She wanted certainty. The nurse gave her what was available. Frank swallowed and asked the question in a voice that barely worked. "She gonna wake up?" The nurse hesitated. That pause said more than any answer. "We're doing everything we can," she said, then turned back inside before Frank could reach for more. Time lost its normal edges. The night staff rotated in and out with the same weary competence. Machines clicked, pumps sighed. A ventilator whispered through tubing. Every so often, an alarm chirped, and someone silenced it with a fast hand and a faster adjustment. Brooke and Jace took turns sitting in the waiting area chairs, then standing, then pacing again, because sitting felt like giving up. Frank never truly sat. When he tried, his knees shook from the effort, and he pushed himself back up with his cane, jaw clenched in stubborn refusal. Koa shifted positions, only to stay closer, nose, occasionally touching Frank's boot, as if checking that he was still there. Around 2 a.m, someone brought coffee that tasted burned and thin. Brooke drank it anyway. The warmth kept her from shaking. Jace took one sip and set the cup down untouched, his gaze locked on the ICU doors. A few older men in battered jackets remained posted along the wall, quiet as stone. They spoke to each other in short murmurs that never drifted far. Their eyes flicked to Frank, to Brooke, to the door. They did not offer comfort with words. They offered it with presence. Frank finally asked one of them, voice low, almost embarrassed, "How'd you even hear?" The man looked at Frank for a long moment, then took out his phone and tilted the screen so Frank could see. A message thread. Names Casey would not know. Numbers with no saved contacts. A photo of Koa's vest, taken in the hallway, the worn Velcro, and the stitched name clear. "She protected him," the text said. 5 wounds. Bayview. The man pocketed the phone again. Norfolk's small, he said. And some people keep their ears open. Frank's throat worked. He stared down at his cane, as if it might tell him what to do with his hands. In the ICU, Casey did not wake. Her body fought in quiet increments each hour, earned by someone's steady hands and her own stubborn biology. Brooke watched the nurse, who sat at Casey's bedside, through the glass. The nurse smoothed Casey's hair back once, an intimate gesture done with the same care as adjusting a drip. Brooke pressed her fist to her mouth to keep from making a sound. Near 4, a night shift. Doctor came out, eyes tired, voice measured. She's still unstable, he said, but she's not crashing. That's good. Brooke nodded too hard, as if agreement could anchor the statement. Frank whispered, thank you to no one in particular. The doctor's gaze dropped to Koa. The dog's vest looked older under fluorescent lights. The fabric dulled, the edges frayed, like it had been through too much and was still expected to hold. The doctor did not ask questions. He had learned that some stories arrived on their own timeline. He went back inside. Outside, the city moved in its sleep. The mist off the river thickened and thinned with the wind. Streetlights painted the wet asphalt in tired gold. A few delivery trucks rumbled along the main road. A distant ship horn moaned once, then faded. At the security booth, by the front lot, Dante Hargrove had been fighting the same battle with his eyelids for an hour. He had switched to water, then back to coffee. The coffee was winning, only because it was warm. The access road lay mostly empty. Then, headlights appeared around the bend, slow, deliberate. A dark sedan rolled in and parked without hesitation. The engine shut off. A man stepped out and stood for a moment, with his hands at his sides, looking up at Bayview's lit windows. He was not dressed in uniform. Jeans, a plain jacket, haircut close, stillness in his posture that looked practiced. Dante watched him take a breath, then walk to the edge of the lot and stop under a lamp. He did not check his phone. He did not look around like he was lost. He simply stood. Another set of headlights arrived. A pickup older paint chipped at the wheel wells. It eased into a space and shut down. 2 men climbed out. They moved with quiet economy, greeting the first man with a nod, a forearm, grip, a touch to the shoulder that lasted half a second longer than casual. A motorcycle rolled in, next engine low, then cut. The rider swung off and tucked the helmet under an arm. A second motorcycle followed, then a third. Dante picked up his radio thumb, hovering. He did not press it yet. More vehicles came, dark shapes in the mist, some shiny and new, some worn like they had been driven hard and kept anyway. People stepped out into the cold and arranged themselves in small clusters, all of them facing the building, as if the windows were a horizon. Dante opened the booth door and stepped outside. The cold hit his face like a slap. He walked a few paces toward the nearest group, careful not to sound like he was coming in hot. Morning, he called. A man turned. His eyes swept Dante in a single quick pass, not rude, just thorough. Morning, the man said. Can I ask what's going on? Dante kept his tone light, neutral. The man's gaze slid past Dante to the hospital entrance. The automatic doors glowed behind glass. Somewhere deep inside, a monitor beeped, muted but steady. We're waiting, the man said. Dante frowned. Waiting for what? The man did not answer directly. He nodded toward the building with a small tilt of his chin. Your staff, he said. She's in there. Dante's stomach tightened. He thought of the rumor that had moved through the night shift the one nurses did not say out loud in front of patients. A stabbing. A nurse. A bad one. Dante looked closer at the man's collar. A small pin flashed under the lamplight, 3 prongs, catching gold and throwing it back. It was subtle, not meant to shout, but it was unmistakable. Dante exhaled slowly. How many of you are coming? He asked, before he could stop himself. The man's mouth tightened into something that might have been a restrained smile. However many hear about it. Dante did not like crowds. Crowds meant unpredictability, but there was nothing wild here. No raised voices, no swagger, no restless motion. Just people arriving and settling into stillness like it was a job. He nodded once and walked back to the booth radio, still quiet. Inside Bayview, the first early shift nurse stepped into the lobby and stopped short at the sight through the glass. She stood at the window, coffee cup halfway to her mouth, and stared. A second nurse joined her, an orderly pushing a cart slowed, and then stopped too. The lobby grew quiet in the way a room does when something larger than routine enters it. On the 3rd floor, a pediatric patient in a wheelchair rolled toward the window with a blanket over his legs. His mother followed, one hand on the chair. Mom, the boy whispered, breath fogging the glass. Who are they? His mother did not answer right away. Her eyes stayed on the lot, on the line of bodies, growing thicker as more people arrived. I don't know, she said, but her voice softened anyway. They look like they're here for someone. Back in the ICU corridor, Brooke's phone buzzed. She stared at the screen with an impatience that felt like desperation. Another message thread. A coworker she barely knew from day shift. Look outside. Brooke blinked confused, then stood and walked to the end of the hallway, where a window looked down over the front lot. Her legs felt rubbery from hours without sleep. Jace followed silent. Brooke pressed her forehead to the cold glass. Below, the parking lot was filling, not with families carrying balloons or flowers, not with commuters heading into a normal day, with men and women standing in loose formation, shoulders squared, faces turned toward the building, quiet, as if sound might break something delicate. Even from 3 floors up, Brooke could see the way some of them carried themselves, the posture, the stillness, the scanning eyes that moved as if they were checking angles and distances without thinking. Jace's breath left him in a slow exhale. They're SEALs, he said, voice low. Brooke's mouth went dry. She kept staring, trying to count, and failing, because the line kept changing as more vehicles arrived. A few people moved into the lobby, then stopped looking up at the ICU floors, as if they were trying to see through walls. Brooke turned and walked back fast, nearly tripping over her own feet. In the waiting area, the older men along the wall had noticed too. One of them stood with a grunt and walked toward the nurse's station, cap pulled low, eyes steady. Frank looked up at the movement. His face held confusion first, then something like dread. He had lived long enough to know when a room shifted. Frank, one of the older men, said gently. Frank stood cane-scraping. What is it? The man nodded toward the window further down the corridor. Frank took a step, then another. Koa rose and followed at his heel body close. At the window, Frank saw the lot. Rows of people. More than a handful. More than a dozen. The number kept growing, headlights still turning in at the far end like a slow procession. Frank's mouth opened. No sound came out at first. Brooke stood beside him now, arms wrapped around herself. Her eyes were red, but her gaze was sharp. They heard she whispered, voice unsteady. Frank stared down at the pin glints, the tight clusters, the unbroken attention aimed at the building. His grip on the cane tightened until his knuckles went pale. They're here for her, he said. And the words came out like an admission he did not know how to hold. Koa made a soft sound and pressed its shoulder into Frank's leg. The dog's tail thumped once against the linoleum, slow and deliberate, as if it recognized the shape of this kind of waiting. A nurse passed behind them, glanced out the window, and stopped. Her face changed. She lifted a hand to her mouth. Then she walked away quickly, eyes shining. Downstairs, Dante watched the crowd settle. A few people carried coffee cups. Some set them on the hood of a car and never drank. A man in a weathered jacket crouched and held out a hand to Koa when the dog later appeared at the glass panel by the elevator area, as if the building itself had offered a glimpse. Koa could not reach him, but the man still waited there, palm open, patient. The sun began to thin the night. The mist turned pale, then silver. The hospital windows reflected the first light in hard squares. Inside the ICU, the monitor kept its steady rhythm. Nurses moved with quiet concentration. Tubes stayed taped. Drips stayed measured. Casey remained still beneath blankets and bandages, her chest rising with the help of a machine, her skin pale under fluorescent light. Outside, the line of people did not break. They stood facing Bayview in the cold morning air, their attention held like a vow that did not need words. Inside, the ICU morning arrived without ceremony. The lights stayed the same, hard white. The air stayed dry and cold. The machines did not care about sunrise. They kept their rhythms with stubborn patience. Each beep spaced like a metronome. Each hiss of oxygen steady enough to sound calm. If you did not know how close calm could be to the edge. Brooke sat in the chair beside Casey's bed, with her arms folded tight across her chest. She had been awake too long. Her eyes burned. She kept blinking, like she could blink the fear out of them. Every few minutes, she leaned forward and checked Casey's face, as if something might change if she looked away. Jace stood near the foot of the bed, hands in his pockets, shoulders set. He had the posture of someone who wanted to be useful and hated waiting. He watched the ventilator, tubing the lines taped to Casey's arms, the slow rise and fall under the blanket. A nurse moved in and out with quiet speed, checking drips, touching buttons, reading numbers, without speaking them out loud. She adjusted the pulse oximeter, clipped to Casey's finger, and smoothed the blanket edge, as if neatness mattered. On the other side of the glass doors, the corridor was crowded with people who did not belong to Casey by paperwork, but refused to leave anyway. Frank Delaney stood closest to the window panel cane, in one hand, the other hand resting on the doorframe, like it was the only solid thing in a building built of rules. Koa sat at his feet, body tense and still. The dog's vest looked even more worn under the ICU lights. The Velcro edges softened by time, the stitched name KOA clear against faded fabric. The dog's gaze stayed fixed on Casey, unblinking. Frank's lips moved silently. Not quite prayer, not quite apology. His eyes were red swollen from hours of holding back tears that kept trying to break through his pride. Inside the room, Casey's eyelids twitched. It was small. A flicker, almost nothing. Brooke saw it anyway. She lurched forward, chair legs scraping the floor. "Casey," she said, voice cracking on the name. She looked at the nurse. "Did you see that?" The nurse was already at the bedside, one hand hovering over the monitor panel, the other checking Casey's pupils. With a small light, her face stayed composed, but her eyes sharpened. "Casey," the nurse said, calm and close. "Can you hear me?" Casey's eyelids fluttered again. Her brow tightened faint lines, forming between her eyebrows. The ventilator continued its steady push and pull, doing the breathing for her. Brooke pressed her hands to the edge of the mattress, careful not to touch any lines. Her voice dropped lower, intimate. "Hey," she said. "I'm here. You are in Bayview. You're safe." Jace stepped closer, his gaze locked on Casey's face. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence filled the space anyway, steady as a hand on a shoulder. Casey's eyes opened. At first, they were unfocused, glazed with exhaustion and medication. She stared at the ceiling as if it were a strange sky. A second passed, then another. Her eyes moved slow and searching, and landed on Brooke. Something shifted in her expression. Confusion first, then recognition, faint and fragile. Brooke made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "There you are," she whispered. Casey tried to speak. The tube in her mouth made it impossible. Her lips moved around it useless. Panic flashed in her eyes, sharp and immediate, the way it always did when a person woke to a body that would not obey. The nurse put a hand on Casey's forehead. Gentle, but firm. "Do not fight it," she said. "You have a breathing tube. You are okay. Blink if you understand me." Casey blinked once hard. Brooke swallowed and wiped at her face with the heel of her palm. "You scared the hell out of me," she said, voice trembling. She tried to smile and managed a crooked version of it. "You always do things the hard way." Casey's eyes stayed on Brooke's face, as if it was the only anchor in the room. Then her gaze shifted to Jace. Her brows lifted slightly, a question without words. Jace leaned in, just enough for her to see him clearly. "You are back," he said, voice low. "That is what matters." Casey tried to move her hand. The effort made her fingers twitch against the sheet. A line tugged lightly at her wrist. The sensation made her flinch. Pain arrived a beat later, slow, and then sudden blooming, through her abdomen like a hot tide. Her eyes squeezed shut, her forehead creased. The monitor responded with a faster rhythm, the beep tightening a soft alarm, chirping and warning. The nurse pressed a button to silence it and adjusted a drip. "Easy," she murmured. "Do not try to sit up." Brooke reached for Casey's hand and wrapped her fingers around it. Her grip was warm and shaking. "I have you," she said. Casey opened her eyes again. Tears gathered at the corners, not dramatic, just inevitable. She stared at Brooke's hand, holding hers, as if she could not quite believe it. The nurse checked the chart at the foot of the bed, then glanced at Jace. "She is awake and following," she said. "We can start waking trials. Let her settle." Brooke nodded too fast. "Can she see him?" she asked, voice dipping. The nurse followed Brooke's gaze toward the door. Frank's face hovered behind the glass panel, eyes wide and raw. Koa sat beside him, like a statue that breathed. The nurse hesitated for a fraction of a second, then made a decision. She stepped to the door and cracked it open. The lock clicked. "Only one," she said to Frank, firm. "And the dog stays calm." Frank's hand tightened on his cane. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, out of habit. Then he shook his head once hard and stepped through the doorway. Koa rose immediately and followed silent nails, clicking softly on the floor. The dog stopped at the threshold, waited for Frank's hand signal, then moved in close, beside Frank's leg. The vest brushed Casey's bed frame as they approached. Frank walked like his body had aged a decade overnight. He reached the side of the bed and stopped, unsure where to put his hands. His eyes moved over the tubing and tape and bruises blooming beneath Casey's skin. He looked stricken by the reality of what she had taken on for him. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice broke on the word. Casey's eyes locked on his face. Recognition stirred slow. The alley, the cold, the flash of steel, Frank's shout, Koa's bark. The memory came in fragments, sharp edges, and her body reacted before her mind fully caught up. Her breathing hitched against the ventilator. Frank leaned closer, not touching her at first, as if he was afraid he would hurt her, just by being near. "I am here," he said, hoarse. "I have been here." Casey's hand shifted in Brooke's grip. Her fingers flexed. Brooke understood and loosened enough for Casey to reach. Casey's fingertips brushed Frank's hand. Frank grabbed her hand like it was a lifeline. His palm was rough, warm, trembling. He bowed his head over their joined hands and squeezed his eyes shut. A tear dropped onto the sheet, darkening the fabric in a small spot that spread slowly. "I am sorry," Frank whispered. The words sounded like they cost him something. "I did not mean for you to get hurt. I did not mean any of it." Casey's eyes filled. She tried to shake her head. The motion was too much. She blinked instead, slow and deliberate, and tightened her grip on Frank's hand. Koa stepped closer and put his head near Casey's hip, careful not to touch the bandages. The dog's eyes lifted to Casey's face. For a moment, there was no training in the look, only something quieter, something that felt like recognition. Casey's fingers moved again, weak and searching. Brooke guided her hand down until Casey's fingertips found the dog's fur. It was coarse and warm. The contact made Casey's shoulders ease by a fraction. "Hey." The nurse watched the monitor and adjusted another setting. "Keep her calm," she said. "She is still fragile." Brooke nodded, lips pressed together and tears spilling anyway. Casey's gaze drifted toward the window. Outside the parking lot, spread out in pale morning light. The mist had thinned. The line of people remained. Men and women standing still, facing the building, shoulders squared. Some wore plain jackets, some wore old gear that looked kept for occasions that mattered. Small metallic glints flashed when they shifted under the lamps. Casey stared, eyes widening. Her heart rate jumped again. The monitor beeped faster. The soft alarm chirped once more. The nurse silenced it and leaned in. "Do not panic," she said quietly, following Casey's gaze. Her expression softened. "They have been there." Brooke's voice shook when she spoke. "They heard what you did," she said. "That dog is one of theirs. They came. They have been waiting." Casey looked at Brooke confused, trying to fit the words into her understanding of the world. She looked at Frank, still holding her hand, like he could not let go. Then she looked back out the window at the still line of people. Tears slid down her temples and into her hair. She could not wipe them away. Her arms felt too heavy. She let them fall. Frank lifted his head and followed her gaze. His mouth opened slightly, stunned all over again, as if the sight still did not feel real. "They came," he said, voice barely audible. Brooke nodded, yes. Frank's grip tightened. He looked back at Casey, eyes shining with something fierce and helpless. "You should not have had to stand in front of that," he whispered. Casey met his eyes. Her expression was exhausted, pained, but steady. She could not speak around the tube. She did not need to. The set of her gaze held the same answer she had carried in the diner. Koa let out a soft whine and leaned his shoulder into Frank's shin. Frank's free hand dropped to the dog's head and rested their fingers splayed, grounding himself on the familiar weight. The nurse stepped back, giving them a small pocket of space. She lowered the light slightly, not enough to dim the room, just enough to soften the edges. Brooke squeezed Casey's hand again. "Stay with us," she whispered. Casey blinked slowly. Her breathing steadied. The monitor's beeps eased back into a calmer rhythm. Outside the window, the line in the parking lot held firm still and quiet in the morning air. Inside, Casey's eyes stayed open a little longer, fixed on the shapes beyond the glass, on the glints of metal, on the simple fact of people who refused to look away. Then her eyelids drifted closed, not in surrender, but in exhaustion, her hand still curled around Frank's rough fingers, while the steady beep kept time. Casey slept in thin layers, drifting up and down through pain and medication, while the monitor kept its steady count. When she surfaced, Brooke was still there. Sometimes Jace, sometimes a nurse whose name Casey could not hold on to yet. Frank sat in the chair by the wall, when staff allowed it, hands folded over his cane, eyes fixed on Casey's face, as if her breathing might change if he blinked at the wrong time. Koa lay at his feet, head up, watching every hand that reached toward Casey's lines. By late afternoon, the doctor returned with a small team and a calm voice. He explained things in short phrases, like he was walking across ice. Casey listened, with tired eyes, blinking when she understood. When they finally pulled the breathing tube, her throat burned. She coughed weak and ragged, and tears sprang up from the strain. Brooke held a cup of water with a straw and kept saying, slow, like it was a prayer with instructions. Frank moved closer when Casey could whisper again. His voice stayed low, rough around the edges. You need anything, you tell me. Casey tried to shake her head and regretted it immediately, pain flashing through her abdomen. She pressed her lips together and looked at him instead. The look was enough to make Frank's eyes go wet again. He blinked hard and stared at the floor, ashamed of his own helplessness. The hallway outside never emptied the way a hospital hallway should. There were fewer people once Casey was awake, but not none. Dante, the security guard, kept the front desk staffed and the doors clear. Men and women with close-cut hair and quiet eyes rotated in small groups, speaking in murmurs, asking the same questions with different voices. Is she stable? Can she rest? Does she need blood? They brought coffee that went untouched. They brought clean socks and a soft blanket that Brooke insisted Casey take. Even though the room was warm, someone taped a simple card to the wall near the window. Neat handwriting, no flourish. Casey read it slowly, lips barely moving. We heard. We are here. The first time Casey was moved from intensive care to a regular room, the hallway smelled different. Less sterile, bite, more floor wax, and laundry. The transfer hurt. She clenched her teeth and focused on the squeak of the bed wheels. Brooke walked beside her, one hand on the rail, eyes locked on Casey's face. Frank followed a few steps back, with Koa at his heel, moving like a man afraid the floor might shift under him. Physical therapy began with insults disguised as encouragement. A therapist named Marin lifted Casey's bed and adjusted her pillows like she was preparing a stage. Sit up, Marin said. Casey tried. Her body answered with a sharp protest, a twisting pull that made her vision dim at the edges. Sweat broke out at her hairline. She made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a curse. Brooke leaned in. Look at you, she whispered. So dramatic. Casey rasped. You love it. Frank watched, with his hands clenched on his cane. He looked like he wanted to take the pain for her, and could not figure out where to put that desire. Koa stayed close to the bed, eyes flicking to Casey's face, then to the therapist's hands, then back again. Every time Casey's breath hitched, the dog's ears moved forward. Nights were the hardest. The room quieted. The hallway lights dimmed. Casey's thoughts stopped having distractions. She woke to the memory of Brick scraping her back, to the flash of steel under the security light, to Koa's bark splitting the air. Sometimes she woke to the smell of cinnamon and could not place it until she remembered the crushed paper bag in her fist. Brooke left her phone on the bedside table, with the volume up, a promise that someone would answer if Casey called. When Brooke went home to sleep, Jace would appear at the doorway with a coffee and a look that said he had not really slept either. Bills arrived while Casey could barely walk to the bathroom without shaking. A thick envelope sat on the tray table one morning, the hospital logo crisp in the corner. Casey stared at it until her chest tightened. Brooke took one glance and cursed under her breath. Do not open it alone, Brooke said. Casey lifted her eyes. It's paper. I can handle paper. Brooke's smile was thin. That paper is a knife. They opened it anyway. Casey scanned the numbers and felt dizzy, not from pain this time. She had insurance. She had coverage. She also had a reality that did not care about either. Casey set the papers down carefully and stared at the wall. Her throat tightened, and she hated herself for it. Frank came in that afternoon, carrying another envelope, larger sealed. His hands shook slightly. He held it out like it weighed 100 pounds. I did not ask for this, he said quickly. I did not, but they did it. Casey frowned. Frank, he swallowed. Take it, he said. Please. Brooke reached out and took the envelope, before Casey could refuse. She opened it and pulled out a certified check. Brooke's mouth fell open. 100,000, Brooke whispered, like she was afraid the numbers would vanish if she said it too loud. Casey stared, her vision blurred. She pressed her fingertips to her eyes, then dropped her hand and looked at Frank again. I cannot, she started. Frank's jaw clenched. You can, he said. The words were firm, but his eyes begged. Do not make us watch you bleed twice. Casey's breath shuddered. She nodded once small. The meeting at the Tidewater Veterans Hall happened a week later, after Casey could walk with a slow, careful stride and sit without biting down a cry. Brooke drove her. Jace rode in the back seat because Brooke insisted on it. Frank met them at the door, hat in hand, Koa beside him, tail thumping in a slow, steady rhythm. Inside, the hall smelled like old wood and coffee that had been sitting too long. Flags lined the walls. Photos of young faces stared out from frames. Smiles frozen in another time. Men and women stood as Casey entered, not with applause, but with a quiet shift of attention that made the room feel smaller and heavier. A man with steel gray hair stepped forward. His posture was straight, his voice controlled. Casey Monroe, he said. We have heard your name all week. Casey's cheeks warmed. She looked down and then forced herself to look back up. I did not do it for any of that, she said, voice hoarse. The man nodded once, like he expected the answer. We know. He glanced at Frank, then at Koa, then back at Casey. We need someone who understands bodies and stubbornness. Someone who will tell us the truth and not flinch. We want you to help us. He slid a folder across the table. On the top page, typed in plain letters, were tasks that did not sound like heroism. Scheduling blood pressure checks, coordinating appointments, teaching CPR, connecting men who hated hospitals with people who could help before it was too late. Casey ran her fingers along the edge of the paper. Her scars pulled when she leaned forward. She felt the tug and let it remind her that she was still here. I am a nurse, she said softly. Frank's mouth twitched the closest he came to a smile. Exactly, he said. Casey signed with a hand that still shook a little. Months passed in pieces. Pain that eased, then returned. Stitches that disappeared. A scar line that went from angry to pale. Casey learned to move differently. She learned which breaths hurt and which did not. Some days, she went back to Bayview for a short shift and left exhausted sweat sticking her hair to her neck. Other days, she worked at the hall, setting up folding chairs, checking cuffs, listening to men tell stories that circled around what they could not name. Koa became a regular presence, padding into the hall beside Frank like it was his post. Someone finally fixed the peeling corner of his vest patch, smoothing it down until it lay flat. Casey noticed it one morning and felt something unclench in her chest. On a cold Tuesday evening, Casey stopped by Harbor Light Diner again. Not as a ritual, not as a dare, just because the neon was lit and she wanted coffee that tasted like it had a history. Frank was with her. Koa lay under the counter space they had claimed calm and watchful. Brooke slid into the booth across from Casey, with a grin and 2 forks already stealing fries. The bell above the door rang when someone entered. A clear, simple sound. Casey's shoulders tensed for half a second, out of old habit, then eased when she saw it was just a couple shaking rain off their jackets. Casey wrapped her hands around her mug and felt the heat seep into her palms. Outside the window, the street glistened. Inside, the light was warm. Far away in the back of her memory, a monitor kept time. Here in the diner, the bell rang again as the door closed and the sound settled into the steady murmur of people eating and breathing and staying.